you all for your patience and thank you for coming. And we're starting off a bit late, but I'm sure because we're only 3 presenters, we should definitely still have time at the end for questions. So I'm supposed to be the chair, but because I'm doing the first presentation, perhaps Melanie, you can let me know when 5 minutes are left.
I can
so that.
You know,
Oh, okay, yeah. Throw something at me, because I can't really see you. So I think we are good to go. We'll just start off with my presentation on ethnicity, and then Melanie and Wairimo will follow. So my name is Nyambura, and I'm from University of Ottawa. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about ethnicity in Kenya. And I picked up this graphic from one of our dailies over the weekend, and I thought it really just captures some of the sentiments, popular sentiments, whenever public political appointments are made. And this is in response to the cabinet postings that were made about 2 weeks ago. And the reference here to our community, I don't know if you can all see, is a reference to ethnic groups. So in the cartoon, it says, they're trying to finish our community. We want cabinet posts for our community. Our community is locked out of the government. So just every time that public announcements of political appointments are made, there's that sentiment of people trying to identify with those who have been appointed and whether they represent the ethnic groups in the country. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to focus on some aspects of my paper. So I'll start off with a brief introduction, set the context in Kenya on ethnicity right now, and then just mention research methodology, then look at definitions of ethnicity and ethnic groups within the Kenyan context, look at how ethnicity has developed from colonial times to now, and then end with a few findings for the conclusion. So we go to the next slide. And so when we look at ethnicity in Kenya and how salient it is to the Kenyan society, I can just give 3 examples. So starting with the 2007-8 post-election violence, which perhaps many of you got a chance to hear about because it was internationally televised. It happened along ethnic lines, and this was not the first. Ever since 1961, there has been violence around electoral times, especially starting in 1992, 97 elections, 2002. Around election time, people are mobilized along ethnic lines towards violence. So this has been an issue from 2000, from 1992, but 2007 was the biggest, on the largest scale. And following this, to respond to this, the government set up a permanent commission for integration and cohesion to try and bring together these ethnic groups and deal with issues of ethnic discrimination. And this is a National Cohesion and Integration Commission. So in 2011, they did a report on public service appointments, trying to see how the representation of the groups is in the government public service departments, and found that 70% of the appointments are held by 70% are held by 5 of the ethnic groups, and 20 groups only hold 1%. So, and it reflects, the first 2 who hold the most positions are reflective of the presidents who have been in government since the beginning of independence. So I think it just gives a picture, going back to the earlier slide of the picture on public appointments, that it reflects, it has a ripple effect of the president and the positions and public service appointments. And then in 2013, what we saw was a little bit different, because election violence happened, as they called it, virtual violence on social media. It's big, and there has been a lot of response to this through the media filtering. The comments that people make on the online articles, they've had to filter, and one of the media houses was commenting on how half of the comments that come in cannot actually be put up because they reflect various elements of hate speech. And the government and NCIC are also now prosecuting Facebook administrators and people who have been on Twitter with hate speech. So it has really been big. So that's just the context. So my research question is really simple, and just looking at what are the factors that have contributed to the present state of ethnicity in Kenya. And this is by looking at literature and the media on these issues. Then setting the context, yes, sorry. Definitions, when we talk about ethnic groups, we're talking about the 40 or so odd ethnic groups as per categorized during the colonial administrative times. They're ethno-linguistic groups. They share common languages and cultural and historical markers. But there's also variations in what we mean when we say ethnic groups, because there's some that are like supra-ethnicities, like there's a group called the Carleton group, which is made up of a subset of 9 Nandi-speaking groups. So it's not perhaps the same as another ethnic group that could just be entirely of one subset of identities. So in the census of 2009, they actually reflected this, whereby people could identify themselves as either your supra-ethnicity as Kalenjin, or as Turgen, or as Nandi. So it's not one kind of ethnic group that we're speaking about. And then ethnic identity is acquired through birth, and it's patrilineal. You get the ethnic identity of your father. So that, much as ethnic identity has been constructed politically and socially, there's also the element of ethnic cognition that is primordial, people believing that you inherit your ethnicity. And then looking at ethnicity, it's not a neutral term in Kenya. It is something that is value-laden, and people think about it in terms of negative ethnicity, how ethnicity has been instrumentalized politically, socially, and economically towards certain goals, and we'll see a bit more about that later, such as ethnic cleansing. During electoral times, there's a lot of ethnic violence or threats or intimidation to get people who are not in their right region to move out, so that they can ensure the vote and make sure that it stays within the right community. So moving on, looking at development of ethnicity from Kenya, I found 2 primary factors, and that is the control of the state and control of national resources, and how politics through politics, ethnicity has been used to gain control of the state and national resources. So in colonial times, I look at categorization of ethnic groups and designating ethnic territory, so that if each ethnic group had an ethnic territory, so people were connected to their land, and that set the basis for ethnic-based politics. So in 1957, when the Legislative Council was having admitted to the first African elected leaders, they came in based on the support they had from their region, which meant from their ethnic group. So from 1957, they had to have ethnic support to be able to get into political positions. And then just before the independence, there were two political parties. That was the Kenya African National Union and the Kenya African Democratic Union. And whereas the KANU was seen as being more nationalistic, it brought together the bigger ethnic groups. So the minority ethnic groups felt they needed to protect their interests and formed KADU, which came in on the platform demanding for federalism, so that they could be able to control their own territories. So coming in from that, they demanded for federalism to be included in the independence constitution, and that led to ethnic clashes and cleansing in 1961 in the Rift Valley and the coastal areas of Kenya, which was mainly to expunge all the foreigners, meaning all the people from communities that were not considered as native to that land. And then another thing that I found quite interesting is the use of ethnic symbols on a national platform, and how the first president used ethnic symbols such as oathing. In 1968 elections, the president got his community to take oaths to say that they would be united and the presidency would remain within the ethnic group. And failure to this, if you are disloyal, death would be the consequence. And so using this ethnic symbol for a national political process was one of the ways in which politics started to become ethnicized. And also, during that campaign period, he also used a Kikuyu rite of passage to deride his opponents, because they didn't practice it. So therefore, they were not men, and they could not be considered as eligible for the same posts. Then we look at ethnic favoritism, and we've talked about that in the public appointments. Kenyatta, Moi, and Kibaki, those are the 3 previous presidents, have all surrounded themselves with advisors, and key political positions are given to people of their ethnic group. So this has been a trend over the last 3 presidents. Governments. And then also ethnic cleansing. Around election time, 92, 97, 2002, 2007, before and after, ethnic cleansing, get rid of the people who might be able to switch the vote and take it in the direction that people don't necessarily want it to go. Then looking at secondary factors, these are all interrelated. I must emphasize that even though part of control of the state and control of national resources, it has been through violence and issues of land. So, but these have also had a social side towards it. And looking at land as one of the key issues, at independence, one of our national leaders, Tom Mboya, who was later assassinated, said that independence was based on two pillars: constitution and land. These were the two most important things that Kenya needed to get right in order to move on. So starting from 1939, there was the White Highlands Order that saw the colonial government appropriate all the choice lands in Kenya and displace people, which led to landlessness. And these landless squatters are the ones who later started the Mau Mau movement that agitated for independence. So the link between land and the people is really strong. So I just emphasize that people are attached to land. There's a notion of ancestral land, first because, your myth of origin is that we were here, we were the first people here, so this is our land. And then the colonial attachment of territory to ethnic groups also emphasize that. And then the fact that people bury on their land means, thank you, people bury on their land means that there is that attachment to, my people are buried here, so I cannot leave this land. So land is really a big thing that has been used to instrumentalize ethnicity. People are promised land. If you vote this way, we will get your land back, or get rid of these people so that we can get the vote. Then violence, as I have mentioned, as violence has just been increasing in levels from 1992, when in 1991 the president, who was at the end of the single-party state, said that at the advent of multipartism would bring ethnic conflict. But it wasn't really a prophecy, it was more of a tried and tested strategy that if we intimidate people and threaten them, they will move, and then we can make sure that our people are here in this area and they will vote the way we want them to vote. So that has happened until 2007. And then hate speech on social media. And one interesting thing I'll mention here is that in the 2007-2008 elections, the violence happened in low-income areas. So people said, oh, it is the poor and illiterate masses who are out there fighting, and they have nothing to lose. But now with the hate speech on social media, there's a demographic shift. These are people who are, who have access to social media with smartphones, computers, young people, literate. So it really shows that it's a problem, not only at levels, it's a problem to control at all these different levels. And that's why I think there's quite a number of legislation dealing with issues like hate speech, from the Penal Code to the Constitution, the NCIC Act, the Media Act. There's just a lot of issues dealing with that. And finally, the conclusion. So just 4 things I'll highlight, and I'm really just summarizing because I've mentioned this. So just the influence of geography and political representation. The fact that to be a political leader, you need support from your region. Your region is your ethnic group, or the majority ethnic group in that area. And the fact that people have tended historically to vote along ethnic lines because they have been mobilized as such. And then consolidating political power has happened, that once a president comes in, he'll make sure that all the political appointments go to people who will help him keep political power within the ethnic group. And then this also affects access to national resources. For example, when the tenders come in, the people who get them are the people who are from the right groups. So it'll affect socially, economically, has ramifications on all those levels. And then land and belonging. People are attached to their land for various reasons, not only because of farming, but because of all the reasons that we've talked about. And then finally, cycles of violence, and what this has done to crystallize identity and the exclusivity of ethnic groups, as people have fought time and again, and with the death and destruction with each election, and even in between elections, has made people really feel it's us and them. And this is reflected now on the social media. You can really tell that there's a sense of these ethnic groups are separate and have different objectives and different goals. So that has really affected the salience of ethnicity in the Kenyan society, and it's something that's being dealt with at various levels. The end. Thank you. I think now we'll move to Melanie.
Okay, so this actually syncs very well from the previous presentation because I had in my paper a lot of background about ethnicity, and so we won't need to go over that now, which is great. So now in this paper, I'm talking about something that is in a lot of ways related to ethnicity and its construction. So one researcher in 1969 was writing about the language in Kenya and said, as in many multilingual parts of the world, the language problem has become serious. Now, language being a problem, multilingualism being a problem, is something that we see a lot in many parts of the world, and it's related to the idea of a nation state having one common language. And now, as then, Kenya is a country with a lot going on in the linguistic sphere. There's many languages, there's a large population of multilingual people, and a new way of speaking called Sheng. Sheng is based mostly on the structure of Swahili, but it incorporates vocabulary from English and from lots of other languages in Kenya. It's very fluid and dynamic. It varies between neighborhoods and social groups. It has been called many things. It's been called a new dialect of Swahili, a Creole, a Pidgin, a new language, or just slang. And it's become sort of a topic of debate in the public sphere in Kenya in recent years. But the central focus of this paper is not Sheng itself, but ideas surrounding Sheng and how people talk about Sheng. Change the slide. When people talk about Sheng in the newspapers, in the public sphere, what do their opinions show about how people think about what work language does, or how it relates to different parts of culture and society? Can we see echoes of European colonial discourses about language and European language policies in attitudes, especially negative attitudes towards Sheng? When people criticize it, and they say we shouldn't be speaking this, what presuppositions, what beliefs are they using to do that? And why do they think that? So put differently, why do some people think that Sheng is a problem? And where do these reasons come from? Can we look at the history of these ways of thinking? So my paper seeks to shed some light on these questions by tracing past discourses and policies, both in the colonial and the post-colonial era. I argue that British colonial agents brought with them certain ways of thinking about language and about categorizing languages. These European ideologies and the colonizing agents altered both the language situation on the ground in Kenya and the way a lot of elite or educated Kenyans think about language. And some of the legacies of these language ideologies and practices can be seen in the negative responses to Sheng in the public sphere. So in particular, I argue that the existence of Sheng violates the image of languages as bounded, homogeneous entities. It is seen as a language without a proper culture, and it threatens state control over the Kenyan national project. So if you want to move to the next slide. So the theoretical framework of this paper is the language ideologies literature from anthropology. So basically, language ideologies are the ideas with which participants and observers frame their understandings of the linguistic varieties and map those understandings onto people, events, and activities that are significant to them. So we call these conceptual schemes ideologies because they are suffused with the political and moral issues pervading this particular sociolinguistic field and are subject to the interests of the bearer's social position. So they're essentially the presuppositions we bring to the table when we talk about languages and the people who speak them. They're not generally stated out loud, but they are often behind discussions about language. You can stay there. So in the paper, I have a large section on language ideologies and the general literature. Because of time, I'm not going to go into that right now. I also have a lot of background on the Kenyan context and the history there. And here I'm going to focus mostly on Sheng in the present day. But first, a very quick look at sort of colonialism and the types of things that, the types of language ideologies that came with colonialism and in the post-colonial era. So Ali Mazrui has said that a new culture of borders was brought by the colonizers, and this, we often think of this in terms of the arbitrary borders between that were created the new states. But this also can be applied to things like tribe, ethnicity, and language. As Nyambura said, the tribes in Kenya are seen, and ethnic groups in Kenya are seen as ethno-linguistic groups. The British strongly believed, not that just the British, but a lot of Europeans, coming out of 19th century German Romanticism and the ideas of Herder, that one tribe, one ethnic group equals one language. So borders were placed not just around new states, but about languages, around languages. Missionaries and colonial officials put significant effort into codifying and creating written standards for these languages. And each tribe would have one language, for instance. There was a project, especially with the Luya language, which was attempted to standardize and bring different dialects together. And this happened all over Africa. In many places, they actually created new dialects that no one actually spoke in an attempt to bring together all the different varieties that were spoken in different villages and in different areas. There's a very good article about this happening for Igbo in Nigeria. It's a really fascinating process. But so this was partially because of religion. Missionaries were very interested in bringing literacy so that tribes, Africans could read the Bible in their vernacular tongue. So in order to translate the Bible into a language, you need a standard, a written standard. But also because of the dual mandate of British colonialism. And part of this was using English at the national level, but also indirect rule through tribal authorities. And in order to use vernacular languages in local governance, you need to have a standard. You need to have a written language. And because of the one-to-one link between language and culture and ethnic group, this language standardization was done at the level of the tribe. And then in the post-colonial era, Swahili was often used as a symbol of national unity, of bringing Kenya together, and sort of counteracting this British emphasis on indirect rule through the tribe and through the ethnic group. If you want to go to the next slide. So in recent discourse about Sheng, and this comes from both academic articles and from my own analysis of a lot of newspaper articles discussing Sheng in the Daily Nation, which is one of the Kenyan main newspapers. And there are three main arguments that we see in criticisms of Sheng. And the first is that it violates language boundaries. So you see things like Sheng renders children unable to speak proper Swahili or proper English. Teachers say it has spoiled students' language. And you can see this, you can relate this to the idea of one tribe equals one language, one nation equals one language, but also an idea that Monica Heller, who is at OISE at U of T, calls parallel monolingualisms. And that multilingualism is valued, but only if the languages are not mixed. So multilingualism is seen as parallel multilingualisms in each language. If you mix the languages, this is not acceptable. And this can be related back to this idea of language as something that has a boundary and has one standard, one way of speaking.
Milena, may I just ask one question? Yeah. Where is Sheng most, can you just give just a few quick details about where it's mainly spoken? Is it mainly Nairobi? Is it other towns? Is it Just a little bit of that detail, so
Sure,
I'll be able to
yeah.
understand the rest of it better.
I believe it's spoken by a lot of young people in Kenya. It started in Nairobi, but I know that
Is it on the coast?
It's
Is
on-
it
I don't
in
know, is it on the
Kisumu?
coast?
Is it-
It's an urban.
it's very urban, but I also
Particularly classic in that it's mostly in marginal urban settlements. That's where it came from. So it's very tied to, for the most part, to material conditions.
Right, okay.
But I know I spent some time in Nanyuki, which is a town
Yes.
north of Nairobi, and I did have people text me in Sheng. So I know that there was some Sheng there as well, and I'd be like, oh. And I didn't realize what it was at the time. I'm like, this is not Swahili or English.
So it's kind of spreading out.
Yeah, I
like the
think
urban
so.
settlements where it kind of starts.
But it is, it's very urban, very youth.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. And this is also, you can see this in an informal rule that at least used to happen in the Kenyan parliament. I'm not sure if it's the same today, but Swahili is an official language of parliament, as is English. But at least up until the 1980s, you were not, members of parliament did not switch between languages. If you started in Swahili, you stayed in Swahili, you did not switch to English. If you spoke in English, you did not switch to Swahili. So Sheng creates a problem for this because by mixing languages, it runs up against people's ideas that languages have one standard and that bilingualism, multilingualism means speaking each language separately. The second idea that we see, the next slide, is Sheng is a language without culture. So the quote that I have up on the slide is from a Daily Nation opinion piece. And it says, mother tongue is losing its significance and being taken over by a corruption of itself, Kiswahili and English in the form of Sheng. Children grow up without a primary language, and due to this, they lose their true sense of identity. So what does this mean is that children grow up without a primary language? When we talk about language, obviously children will be learning, they are learning a language. If they speak English, that's their primary language. If they speak Swahili or Sheng, that's their primary language. But this idea, in the Kenyan context, it often seems that primary language or mother tongue, and I have, it's not in that quote, but mother tongue is a term that's used a lot, but it generally only means the ethnic language. So Kikuyu or Luo or Maasai. And so you have this quote, but you also have people to say that children who grow up without a mother tongue, without a primary language, suffer intellectual disadvantages. It can't give them anything in the way of identity or culture. Another author talked about her children not wanting to learn Kikuyu, that they're growing up in Nairobi. And she concludes that this is because she has not raised them to have enough of an African identity. So here Swahili seems to not even be African enough. African culture resides in the ethnic tribal languages. And so Sheng, because it does not have this culture and this idea of culture being residing in language, Sheng has no culture. Which is of course not true, but that's. And the last one is Sheng and the Nationalist Project. So we see, since Kenya's independence, Swahili has been utilized as a language, as sort of symbolic of national unity. In language policy, English is an official language, but Swahili is also official, but it's called the national language. So this is a role that English cannot play, as it's not local enough. It comes from the colonizers. So the Kenyan government, so you see, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities talks about official nationalism, which is the state, where instead of the nation aligning to the borders of the state attempts to create a nation that aligns to the borders. And Swahili has been part of this project for the Kenyan state. Sheng, however, threatens this project because it defiles the purity of the national language and because it offers a rival form of pan-ethnic community outside the elite's control. So authors say things like, Kiswahili unites us all and gives us a sense of identity, but Kenyans should embrace the use of impeccable Swahili. They should not denigrate it by speaking forms that are not the standard form, and we need language lobby groups in order to fight against the rising Sheng. And Kiswahili, being the national language, should and must be taught and spoken by all Kenyans, young and old. Children growing up, for instance, must learn Kiswahili and be made to understand that it is the national language. Sheng is a monster that will swallow up our age-old Kiswahili in English. So you can draw out of these things several familiar language ideologies. First is the idea of language representing culture and Kenyan culture. But more importantly, they link Swahili with a national culture and community, one that transcends the various ethnic identities. So the development of united standard Swahili language community is seen as contributing to national development. So you also have discourses of language purity, which can be seen, and I talk about this more in the paper I did in the presentation, but also in the colonial period. The British in India and in Kenya as well, and in other parts of Africa, were very concerned about finding the pure forms of these ethnic languages. And not just what people spoke, but in writing down the right, true form. Which is, of course, something that doesn't really exist. If you talk to linguists, languages are always evolving. They're always changing. English is a hybrid language, bastardized form of French and Latin and Germanic languages. So in Kenya,
I've got you back.
Oh, amazing.
On the screen.
all right.
It's only the main computer at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So for the Kenyan state and elite, I'll wrap it up now, controlling Swahili is part of an attempt to control the national project, Kenyan nationalism. And Sheng threatens that because it develops outside of the state's control. It's an alternate form of a Kenyan national identity that the state cannot be involved in. So I've talked a lot about negative attitudes to Sheng, and I don't want to give the impression that this is how most Kenyans think about Sheng. There are a lot of positive things as well, especially young people. They see it as very inclusive. So some of the comments to these articles indicated that languages evolve all the time, as I said. Swahili is alive and kicking. Sheng is part of being Kenyan. It's inclusive. It allows us to transcend different ethnic groups and be just one Kenyan community. So there's a lot of that as well. So you can see that these language ideologies that come out of the colonial period and out of Europe are not hegemonic in Kenya. But it's interesting to see the echoes in a lot of the arguments against this form of speaking. Thanks.
My name is Warimo Kitao. I'm just finishing my master's here at Carleton in journalism, and I come from Mathare. That's where I grew up, that's where I was born, and that's where I call home. And I went back just following your awesome presentations on ethnicity and the divisions, political, economic, and social within Kenya. It's interesting because I went back and did my final project on social media and how young people in this informal settlement are using social media and how the media has been using social media ahead of the last election, which was just 2 months ago, May 4th. So I'm just going to play you part of that. We may not have enough time to play the whole documentary, which is 30 minutes, and then I'll take up a discussion and I'll introduce you briefly to Mathare media, to Mathare radio, and some alternative media that people are trying to come up with to fight ethnicity in a really, really strong way in terms of dividing the country on ethnic lines. So I hope this will be loud enough.
On March 4th, residents of Nairobi's Madera Slum joined millions of other Kenyans at the polls. Uhuru Kenyatta won the election, becoming the 4th president of Kenya. Electoral observers have praised the elections, but Raila Odinga, Uhuru Kenyatta's competitors in the elections, is contesting the final results in court. Kenyatta has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity in connection with the 2007 election violence. In 2007, the new influence of social media is said to have triggered and escalated the violence that few expected. Our reporter Warimo Kitao went to Mathare to examine how social media was used during the recent election campaign and how young people in Madare hope to use it to mitigate a repeat of post-electoral violence in this and future elections.
This is Madera Slums. The slums are only a few kilometers northeast of Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Poor sanitation and open electricity wires are an environmental hazard in Mathare. The exposed wires crisscross the uncovered trenches, leading into various locations and homes. Most homes are shacks made of sheets of iron, mud, sticks, and cement, and are about 3 meters square. Until the fateful post-election violence following presidential and parliamentary elections in 2007, Madera Slum was rarely heard of by the outside world. Incriminating hate messages escalated conflict shortly after the 2007 election. Social media via Facebook, Twitter, text messaging, and blogs played a role in this situation, and Madare was a hotspot for this violence. 27-year-old Elijah Kanyi calls Madare his home.
My name is Elijah Kanyi. I was born in Madare. I've lived here since I was born.
Kanyi ran for Madare constituency parliamentary seat with the Kenyan National Congress Party in the 2013 election. In 2007, he'd seen houses in Mathare go up in flames and machete-carrying youth ready to defend themselves and family. Madare went into yet another election, still haunted by the violence that erupted in the slums 5 years ago. Elijah Kanyi says social media was used to instigate this violence.
In 2007, I was in Madare. I was a journalist by then, and I happened to feel in post-election violence, and it was a tough experience for me. And I saw what other people didn't see. So it was a good experience in one way. As a journalist, it was an experience for me to film chaos because I gained more knowledge on how I can cover violence, which side to stand on when I'm taking my shots, to be on the safer side because safety first. But as a person who was born in Madare, I saw it like how bad leaders are and how willing they are ready to help people kill each other for them to gain powers.
2 other informal settlements around Madare, number 10 and Huruma, also experienced the bloody chaos. Kanyi walks back to the spot where he witnessed the 2007 post-election conflict through his camera.
Yeah, we can just have a walk. I was in Madare from one place to another, walking along, and in number 10, I would see youths holding banners, placards saying Raila, no peace. If you go to another place like Huruma, you see people holding placards saying no Kibaki, no peace. And people are just killing each other for the sake of other peoples to have powers. That's what I saw. And this year, 2013, personally, I don't see people fighting. I don't think people will fight. And if it will happen, I will feel sorry for the people of this community because it seems like they didn't learn.
The lead up to the 2007 post-election violence saw a neck-and-neck race between candidates Mwai Kibaki and Raila Odinga. Odinga from the Luo tribe claimed Kibaki, who comes from the Kikuyu ethnic group, had stolen the election. By most counts, the Electoral Commission rigged the elections in favor of Kibaki. Reports show Mwai Kibaki supporters took to the street to celebrate, while Raila Odinga supporters took to the street to protest the results. What happened thereafter shook Kenyans and the international community as the chaos brought the nation to the brink of civil war. Magdalene Kasuku is 31 years old and a mother to 1 daughter. She was born and brought up in the sprawling Mathare slum. Kasuku has worked as a professional radio reporter for over 9 years, covering social, economic, and political issues in Kenya and in Mathare. In the Bangol's 2007 election, she worked as an electoral observer. Kasuku says she was surprised that despite the preparation for a fair process, Kenyans went to war against each other.
Let me start by before the elections. A lot of civic education had been done, and the community was quite aware that a time had come. They just needed to be wise to vote for whoever they really wanted. No one really predicted who could have been the winner, but I think now towards the elections, we got to know that there were different kinds of groups, communities, setups. We call them the illegal groups, but these groups were really armed. But these are things that we didn't know, like me, I didn't know about it. But it's until now, day one went and we didn't get all the results out, and day two. And I think after day two, there was tension building up in the country, people wondering what is wrong, what's up, I think it's at that time that it dawned on me that, wow, things might be bad, Within 1 hour, this country was on fire.
The countrywide riots in Kenya left more than 1,000 people dead and hundreds of thousands internally displaced. Former presidential aspirant Kingwa Kamenshu says politicians via social media play on the old British colonial divide and rule mantra to build a voters' base.
This question of tribe and ethnicity, it's something that when I got in, I was very determined to fight. To me, it doesn't make sense why we are still conglomerating as tribal units, especially since the last election saw how that divided the country. We still have not healed as a country. And I know people used to say that actually we haven't even really fought. Like they say that this year is when the real fighting will happen. Historical reasons for that, we vote tribally. It was divide and rule used in Kenya. So we identify more with the tribe than with other different categories. So the fact of the matter is that tribe and ethnicity will have a big impact in this election as well, unfortunately.
5 years later, Elijah Kanyi is not only a seasoned journalist, but also an aspiring politician in the 2013 general election. He is aware how social media use contributed to the violence of the 2007 election and can be used to lure young voters for better or for worse.
Social media. Not everybody in Mathare knows about it, but a good number. We are proud as youth. People are on internet, Facebook, Twitter. You can post something and somebody will second it. You can post something, somebody will correct you. But most of the people in this society are not more on internet. But I'm using internet. In Mathare, if you want to win the hearts of people in this society, go to them. And that's what I've been doing. You go to that society, you work with them, you sit with them, and you understand their issues more easier than me posting something on internet and it's supposed to be touching on mothers who don't know how to use it. So internet, I will only target the youths who are more knowledgeable about it.
Since the disputed 2007 election in Kenya, social media used by the youth in Madera Slums has increased. Madera is considered the most dangerous slum in Nairobi, and as is common to most slums around the world, Madera has a wealthy neighbor, Muthaiga Estate, one of the richest residential areas in Nairobi. Despite the rich-poor divide, the hate messages on social media were on ethnic lines during and after the 2007 election. 28-year-old Kingwa Kamenshu was one of 2 female presidential candidates in the run-up to the 2013 election. Her bid was crippled during a party merger. She says Kenyans will be more cautious how they use social media this time around.
2007, the blog sphere and Facebook, especially the blogs, was where there was a lot of incitement and very fiery, negative, tribal debates and all that kind of thing. The fact that we've set up some institutions, I think that might make things less heated in terms of people will be very conscious that I cannot say this. I think people have already been arrested for making comments on Facebook. I don't see it getting as out of hand as it did in 2007. If it looks like it is getting out of hand at any point, that is when the government could come in and decide to regulate it.
So with my 5 minutes, I'll be happy to send this documentary around. I found it really fascinating how different people and different community people, like you've been to informal settlements, and some of you have been to places like Mathare or Kibera, where Sheng is also another, it's the language of the people. It's on Twitter and on Facebook where people don't discuss, the narrative changes, the language changes to, not to English and Swahili, but more so to Sheng. And it changes constantly, and keeping up with that language becomes a challenge. But then again, in terms of how media affects the ethnicity, it all goes back to ownership. And ownership in the sense of going back to how in the colonial time, media was owned by the missionaries and then the colonial government, and then it moved into to the government itself running the media. And now the media is so concentrated, as in Canada as well, to a few people who have the money to buy and sustain media companies. So in essence, it becomes them selling the ideology to the millions of people, rather than people coming up with their own ideologies and questioning issues. So in that case, I have 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And that's how we came up. In 2007, I was doing production work with CNN, and it was that time I was able to go to Madera Slums most of the time, and we were also filming in Mathare too. And it was very, very traumatic and very stressful period of time, just seeing how people turn into each other. And I remember walking down the street, and because I'm dark-skinned, and most Kikuyus are assumed to be lighter skinned compared to the rest of the Kenyan, someone asked me, "Oh, what tribe are you? Are you a Luo or a Kikuyu?" I'm like, "I'm in the Luo." And talking of those divisions among, and my brother there has also mentioned it, the conglomeration of people along tribal lines. And I said, no, I'm actually a Luo. And he said, hello in Luo. And luckily, I knew how to say hello back in Luo. So I was safe. Because, if anything, it was all a tribal warfare for the people. But then doing a deeper analysis, and you're able to talk to a few people who run some of the media houses, and a few activists who say it's not really tribal, it's about the resources, it's about the land, it's about the economic opportunities that exist or don't exist for millions of people in such a country. So that's when a few friends and a few colleagues, including myself and others, came up with Mathare Radio, having grown up here and having seen how the community has developed over the years, as a way to build our own discourse on issues, and as a way to analyze different issues within Mathare. So I can send you the link as well. And it just goes about Mathare Radio. So our operational model is looking into two key principles, which is equality and cooperation. And those are the principles under which we operate as Mathare Radio, because a lot of what's happening in Mathare, people usually want, going back to the patriarchal and like male dominance within community, there's a lot of disconnect between male and female, and most female are not given the opportunity to express themselves, and especially even within the slums community. And unfortunately, it goes such to an extent where the oppressed are not really in a position to express themselves. Even if they do want to express themselves, they are intimidated, and they keep quiet and fall in and go under. So cooperation and equity, we saw working with other people within Madera Slums, within other slums, and within the country to bring people together along different ethnic tribes. So far we have so many vernacular and mother tongue stations within the country that are run by businessmen, by politicians, by wealthy people in Kenya. And again, they also use the media to spread their own ideologies and earn, whether it's for commercial or political reasons, and build that base of voters. So so in essence, that's all about Mathare Radio, and I can show you some awesome photos of the place. So this is us doing a production on the history of Mathare, 2 minutes, the history of Mathare. So the history of Mathare goes back to, it was a valley and it was a quarry, and the businessmen then thought, oh, you know, this place can be awesome to give us stones and bricks for building. So they went and dug up and blew up the place, and it became a valley. And initially it was forested, and people started moving in, the rural-urban migration, as people come into the city to look for work. So it was interesting to talk to all the people and get a feeling of how Mathare was and how cheap things were then, way back in the 60s and in the 50s. So that documentary is also, it's also online, but it's in Swahili. One challenge, again, going back to language, we are looking at a person who can translate the whole website into an understandable language for informal, for people in informal settlements. So could it be a mixture of English and Swahili? So that's a discussion we're having right now, because a language as English, most people will be like, I don't really understand what that person is saying, and we want it to be as inclusive as possible. Yeah, so.
Okay, thank you. I think we have about 15 minutes left for discussion.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And
yeah, thank you. So maybe we can even start off with any questions for Wairimu, since we've just concluded this, in case you need any. So the floor is open. Feel free if you have any questions on anything related to anything that has been presented. This is the time. Or if anyone has a question. Oh, sorry. Oh, hi.
I'm Annie from York University. One of the things, I had the good fortune of spending part of my sabbatical in Nairobi just up until February. And one of the things that struck me around identity, ethnicity, language, and so on, is that religion is very important, but only marginally commented upon in our three presentations. And so it's the second question people ask you. You know, the first is they figure out if you're Kikuyu or Luo. And the second is what you do on Sunday, right? So what do you do on Sunday morning? And you know, going for a run in the forest is actually not the right answer, but nonetheless. And so but it also seems that religion is a little bit more fluid. And I wondered if you could comment on that. So it's not as rigidly patrilineal. It has different relationships to different ethnic identities. And it seems, and this is just totally anecdotal and impressionistic, so not grounded in the research or anything, but that people can switch in a way that might be instructive for trying to challenge more rigid and oppressive, arguably, ethnic identities. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay, just a brief answer, maybe somebody else can add to that. But for me, and I haven't done religion, so it's really just my response as a Kenyan, that there is, even though people appear to be very religious, it's more of a default. If you're not, people say that Kenya is 80-something% Christian. People go to church, but it may not necessarily be practicing. But if you're not Muslim, you're Christian. Right. Or if you're not Muslim and Christian, you're Hindu. You know, like it's depending on where your community, I mean, what your parents practiced is what you are, unless now you switch. But people do, of course, convert. So yes, there is conversion on an individual level. But because people convert on an individual basis, then I don't know how that would influence collective identity. Because, you know, it's an individual thing, whereas ethnic identity is, you know, you don't have a choice. So, but anyway, somebody else may be able to comment on that. As I said, I haven't researched much on religion. So.
No, I just it's really fascinating that you asked that question, because I was doing a research on Haiti and looking at how religion plays such a huge role in determining political, social, and economic structure of the country. And like looking at Mathare, for example, how people shift from a religion to another, and it becomes more of a survival mechanism rather than a faith in something or someone or a divine being. Well, there are people who really believe in that divine spiritual being, but then a majority of them, it's a matter of survival. So if this church is offering food today, and I am going to be of that religion. So if this other church is providing footwear for our children, I'm going to be that religion, because you realize at the end of the day, what's there to lose? As long as you're asked, are you following us in this religion, and you answer yes, they don't need extra proof to, apart from attendance of the Sunday churches and the Sunday masses. So for one, it's seen as, for me, it's more of like a survival mechanism, and also it's an identity for some people. It's what gives people hope despite all the struggles that people have to face up.
Kind of challenge. I mean, I lived in Western Kenya in the early 80s, and I was really struck by, to me, a plethora of different religions, and one of the sort of subsets. So it was Christian, but it was the sort of subgrouping, and some of these were fairly new, so quite new phenomena. People who had rejected the church wanted to meet outside a church structure. One of the driving things I noticed was the anti-alcohol message. So that was really a sort of powerful driver for kind of separating out these sort of smaller subsects. I've just forgotten quite a lot of them, but one, people wore white, men, white hats. I can't remember.
Yes.
So
And then there's
I don't know how widespread that was, but that was anti-alcohol partly driving that.
I have a question, but I don't know if someone wants to add to the religion.
The way religion, if you think of the Marxist thing about religion being the opium of the people, I think Kenyan society is the perfect illustration of that. There's a certain despair in Kenyan society that causes people to seek refuge in the church, in all sorts of churches. And televangelism in Kenya is a very big thing. It's, if you turn on the TV on Saturday and Sunday, we have about 6, 7 different TV stations. All of them are broadcasting one televangelist or another. And it's not just the Jakes from the US and so on. It's also Kenya as well, gone onto the bandwagon, and they're making money with, I don't know how many of you know about the M-Pesa, the ability to post, to send money to the mobile phone.
Yes.
So all those televangelists have a mobile number to which you should send money, and Kenyans, especially women, are glued to their TVs, taking down those numbers and sending any bit of money. They call it seed money, that if you want your business to succeed, you must plant seed money with the church and it will be blessed. And so religion, for me, is doing a lot of injustice to Kenyan society. I don't know where the rain began to beat us. I don't know what the solution is, but that for me is what is happening in religion. There's very little that is spiritual in religion in Kenya for me. A lot of it is keeping up with the so-called Joneses, the neighbors, and so-and-so goes to this church, also go. But also just this idea that you want to lose your sorrows somewhere. And
so it's not a progressive message. I mean, I'm just thinking about in Britain in the Industrial Revolution, late 18th century, a lot of social change is actually being driven by Methodist, Baptist, and kind of a challenge to the orthodoxy of the English church, but it was also carried a lot of social messaging with it. What you seem to be describing now in the kind of televisual age is something that is very non-progressive, actually.
yeah, the mainstream religion has lost out. The out and out Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the African Inland, the Presbyterian Church, which were the original sort of Christian churches, have lost out to just about anybody who can stand at the street corner and start preaching and collect a congregation around them and move into some dilapidated building and build from there. So there are people who have become millionaires, Kenyans who have become millionaires through televangelism, which is why I'm saying it's not a progressive thing. It's a means of pleasing the congregation.
Just add to that, it's a prosperity gospel that people take because that's really what you need at that time. but it also indicates the genesis of that kind of religion in Kenya, because I think we're the generation where for our parents to go to school, they had to have a Christian name, they had to have a Christian denomination. So the genesis of it in our families still lingers to the present. And if I could take this segue to ask a question to Milena and to yourself, Nyambura. So just with regards to your presentation, I think what your work also speaks broadly to is the incompleteness of liberation struggles that didn't destroy the markers that were very colonial and that persist in the coloniality of our existence. So I would think that would be something that could be tackled a bit in your work, because the liberation struggles were formed to challenge this, but they still persist, and it would be good to indicate their incompleteness. And also how I think what I'm also interested in is, and similar to what Barimo was saying, the kind of work that goes to challenge these concretized ethnicities that were very fluid before, because there's a lot of work that goes to challenge them, but we only hear about their persistence, which sometimes for me does a lot to reify the image of the savage African who only exists in bounded identity. So I think it's also interesting to, not to say that they don't exist, but to look at the work that goes to challenge it, because there's a lot of work, even in the most interesting places, that goes to challenge this. So the last thing I would say, not to talk so much, is that maybe we can also look at how capital is broader than ethnicity, and people's pursuit of capital sometimes look at the Uhuru-Ruto alliance. That in itself is a symbol of how capital is broader than ethnicity. And just from Milena, I think it could be interesting if you look at how Swahili itself was not a language until 150 years ago. It came about through capital, because it's traders who really, it's a language for trade, to make trade easier. And so it's interesting how, we're running late, but we'll be done in 5 minutes. It's because the projector wasn't working, but we'll be done in 5 minutes.
We need to get set up.
Yeah, you're welcome to come and get set up. I'll help you. But Milena, my question is for you is, Sheng is also not in any way tied to the middle class in Kenya, and I think it's important to make the distinction that it came from Eastlands. And our ideas about Sheng are also affected by our ideas about the poor. So if people are looking at Sheng badly, it's because we're also looking at